There are things that history buries on purpose, not out of carelessness, not because no one thought to write them down, but because the people who had the authority to preserve them looked at what they had and made a deliberate choice. They decided the world was better off not knowing. What I'm about to tell you comes from three sources that were never meant to be read together. The first is a partial expedition journal recovered in 1896 from beneath the floorboards of a collapsed farmhouse in southern Missouri, sealed in a tin box, wrapped in oilcloth, buried as though the man who put it there understood that someday someone would need to find it, but not yet. The second is an unsent letter written by a county clerk in 1842, addressed to a colleague in St. Louis, describing an encounter that the clerk could not explain and could not stop thinking about. The third is a deposition filed under a false name in the same year, so carefully worded that it reveals almost everything while committing to almost nothing. The document of a man who wanted the record to exist, but didn't want to be the one who had to defend it. Put these three things together, and a picture forms. Not a complete picture. Some parts of it are still dark, but enough of it is visible that I think you deserve to see it. Before I start, and I mean right now, before the first word of this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever come across a piece of history that felt like it had been deliberately kept from you? Not lost, not forgotten, kept. The way you keep something in a drawer that you're not ready to throw away but don't want anyone to see. Tell me in the comments. Because after spending time with these documents, I understand that feeling in a way I didn't before. I understand why someone would bury a tin box under a floorboard and hope the right person found it eventually. Now, let's begin. The year is 1840. The Ozark Mountains of southern Missouri sit differently in the landscape than most American wilderness does. They don't announce themselves the way the Rockies do, or impose themselves the way the Appalachians do along the eastern coast. They are older than both, geologically speaking, worn down by time into something lower and more settled, more horizontal, as though they have made their peace with the earth and are simply waiting. The hills roll. The forests are dense with hardwood, oak, hickory, black walnut, and cut through at irregular intervals by cold, clear creeks that run over limestone shelves and disappear into hollows that don't appear on any map made before or since. The light in spring is genuinely beautiful, pale and green and long in the afternoon, filtering down through canopy that hasn't fully leafed yet, touching the ground in shifting columns that move with the wind. People who grew up there loved it, and people who grew up there also understood, in a way that didn't require discussion, that certain parts of it were not the same as the rest. Certain hollows, certain ridges, certain stretches of forest where the trees grew a little too close together, and the creeks ran a little too silently, and the birds, for no reason you could point to, simply didn't go. These places didn't have names. Naming them felt like the wrong kind of attention. In the town of Calder's Crossing, a settlement of perhaps 300 people at the eastern edge of what locals called the Deep Hollow country, the spring of 1840 arrived the way it always did, with mud and new leaves and the sound of the creek running full behind the mill, and with it arrived a man named Elias Croft, who had been contracted by a business partnership in St. Louis to survey a large tract of wilderness that those businessmen were considering purchasing from the territorial government. Elias was 38 years old. He was the kind of man who is difficult to describe in terms of appearance, because his appearance was almost entirely defined by use. He was lean in the way that men who move constantly become lean, not thin, but economical, as though his body had shed everything it didn't need and kept only what worked. He stood just under 6 feet. His eyes were dark and deep-set under a heavy brow that gave him a perpetually focused look even when he was at rest. His jaw had been broken years before in a fall from a scaffold and had healed slightly off-center, which gave his face a quality of asymmetry that people sometimes found unsettling before they got to know him. His hands were the most distinctive thing about him. Large, thick-knuckled, scarred across the knuckles and the palms from years of field work, and stained at the fingertips with charcoal and drafting ink in a way that never entirely washed out. They were the hands of someone who had been measuring the world for a very long time. He trusted those hands. He trusted his instruments. He trusted what he could see and record and verify. This is worth saying clearly, because it matters for everything that follows. Elias Croft was not a man given to imagination. He was not superstitious. He was not the kind of surveyor who sat around a fire at night telling ghost stories. He was the kind of surveyor who sat around a fire at night going over the day's measurements and looking for errors. He was a professional, and professionals write things down. Over the course of 2 weeks in Calder's Crossing, Elias assembled a crew of 8 men. I won't account for all of them immediately. Some of the names in the journal are lost to water damage, and I'll introduce the others as they become relevant. But the 3 who matter most from the beginning are these. Dr. Harlan Voss, 44 years old, the expedition's physician, heavy-set in a way that suggested he had once been heavier and had lost the weight, gradually through years of walking and long days. He moved deliberately, with the unhurried pace of a man who had learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes. His hands were broad and capable, more like a carpenter's than a doctor's. His eyes were a steady gray, and the steadiness in them was not the steadiness of a man who hadn't seen disturbing things. It was the steadiness of a man who had seen many disturbing things and had learned to sit with them without letting them pull him off balance. He had been practicing medicine in rural Missouri for 15 years, and 15 years of rural medicine in that period meant he had seen things that the medical textbooks of the time had not yet found a category for. He was a good man to have in difficult circumstances. The second was a local guide who went by the name Tatum. His full name does not appear in any of the documents. He was somewhere in his late 50s, small and compact, with pale gray eyes that had the habit, unusual and slightly unnerving if you weren't used to it, of going completely still when he was thinking. Most people's eyes move constantly, tracking small movements, adjusting to light, just staying active. Tatum's, when he was considering something carefully, simply stopped. He would stand there with those pale eyes fixed and motionless, and you would understand, without being able to explain why, that a great deal was happening behind them. He had grown up in the Ozarks. He had spent his entire life in this particular geography, in this particular quality of light and silence, and the land had shaped him the way the land always shapes people who don't try to resist it. He knew the Deep Hollow country. More importantly, he knew what it was. The third was a young man named Wesley Pruitt, 23 years old, working as Elias's surveying assistant. Wesley was of medium height, with the easy, loose-limbed build of someone who had grown up doing physical work and found it natural rather than effortful. He had a habit of talking, not nervously, not to fill silence, but because he was genuinely curious about things and tended to say whatever was on his mind at the moment it arrived there. His laugh came easily and was the infectious kind. The other men in the party liked him almost immediately, which in a group of working men who have just met is no small thing. Wesley was the first one the Hollow noticed, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On the 14th of April, 1840, the party of 9 set out from Calder's Crossing. The morning was clear and cool, with a sky that pale early spring blue that seems to sit lower than summer sky, more intimate with the land beneath it. The mules were loaded with 3 weeks of supplies. They expected to need no more than 12 to 14 days, along with Elias's surveying equipment, the medical bag, bed rolls, and the practical collection of tools that 9 men require when they are going to be living in the wilderness for 2 weeks. Tatum had said very little about the job since Elias hired him. He had looked at the map, a rough, incomplete thing that showed only the broad contours of the territory, and he had been quiet for a long moment, not hesitant in a way that suggested he was going to refuse, more in the way of a man who is making a private decision about how much to say and to whom and when. What he said was this: some of that land had not been walked in a long time. Elias asked why. Tatum looked at him with those pale, still eyes. He said, "The ground in there doesn't hold tracks the way it should. Things go in. They don't always come back the same." Elias noted this in his journal that evening. He wrote it down because it struck him as unusual coming from a practical man. Then he described it as local superstition, and he moved on. The first 4 days were genuinely unremarkable, beautiful even, in the way that the Ozarks are beautiful in April. The hardwoods putting out their first leaves in that particular yellow-green that only lasts 2 weeks before deepening into summer. The creeks running full and cold, with the last of the snow melt from the north, the air carrying the clean, complicated smell of damp earth and new wood. Elias made good progress on the survey. He noted soil types, timber quality, gradient, water access. He sketched ridge lines and measured distances and did the careful, methodical work he had been doing for 16 years. His notes from these days are clean and professional. The handwriting is even. The observations are precise. He was comfortable. He was in his element. The animals seemed healthy. The weather was holding. The men were working well together. Wesley kept everyone's spirits easy with his running commentary on whatever came to mind. Dr. Voss walked with the quiet attentiveness of a man who is always observing, cataloging the plants, watching the other men for signs of strain, keeping notes of his own in a small leather-covered book that he kept in his breast pocket. Tatum walked ahead, as he always did, finding the paths that were easiest without seeming to think about it, reading the terrain the way a reader reads a page, quickly, fluently, without visible effort. 4 good days, and then, on the 5th, they crossed into the deep hollow proper. The change was not dramatic. It announced itself in the way that significant things often do, not all at once, but in accumulation, a series of small things that each, individually, could be explained. It was only when you added them together that the explanation started to feel thin. First, the forest seemed to grow denser, though the tree species were the same as before. The canopy closed in more completely overhead, and the light changed. Not darker, exactly, but different in quality. Flatter, less directional, as though it were coming from several places at once rather than from a single source. Second, the sounds changed. This one is harder to describe precisely because the absence of sound is harder to record than sound itself. But the ambient noise of the forest, birdsong, small animals moving through undergrowth, the constant low-level murmur of living things going about their business, became less frequent, not silent, just reduced, as though the forest were less inhabited here, or as though its inhabitants had decided, for reasons of their own, to be less audible. Elias noted both of these things in his journal. He offered explanations for both of them. He moved on. That night, camped beside a shallow creek that appeared on no existing map, the first real incident occurred. It was after midnight. Elias estimated 2 in the morning by his pocket watch, when Wesley woke the entire camp. He woke them not by crying out, not by some dramatic reaction, but by sitting up in his bedroll and saying, in a voice of careful, controlled calm that somehow conveyed more unease than shouting would have, "There's something outside the camp." The men were on their feet quickly. In the field, you learn to sleep lightly. Wesley said he had been half awake, drifting in that shallow layer of sleep that the unfamiliar sounds of a new place tend to produce, when he became aware of something moving near the camp. He described it as a presence suggested by something he couldn't name. Not sound, exactly, nor not the kind of sound that has a shape you can identify. More like a change in the quality of the air near the edge of camp. The sense of something being close that hadn't been close before. 6 of the men searched the perimeter with lanterns. They found nothing. No tracks. No disturbance in the brush. No sign that anything had been there. Elias wrote that Wesley had likely been half asleep and had mistaken a dream for waking experience. He wrote it kindly, with no implication of mockery. Wesley was not a nervous man, and the explanation was a reasonable one. But then Elias added something, almost at the bottom of the page, in slightly smaller handwriting, as though it were an afterthought he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to include. He wrote that when he walked the perimeter himself, he had noticed that the creek, which had been audible from the camp when they made it, a steady sound of water over stones that had been functioning as a kind of background reassurance, had gone silent. Not dry. Still flowing. He crouched beside it and watched the water move in the lamplight. It was moving. It just wasn't making any sound. He wrote, "I have no explanation for this. I observed it for several minutes. I will watch for it again." Then he crossed back to camp and sat by the dying fire until morning. Day 6. The survey work continued, and Elias was a professional, which meant that strange things at the edge of experience did not stop him from doing his job. He took measurements. He updated his maps. He kept the party moving along the ridge system he had identified as the most efficient route through the territory. It was around midday that Tatum stopped. He was walking ahead, as always, and he simply stopped at the edge of a clearing and stood there without moving. The others came up behind him and found him looking at the center of the space. The clearing was small, perhaps 40 feet across, roughly circular, with a floor of bare earth that was striking only because the surrounding forest was so densely carpeted with leaf litter and undergrowth. Clearings happen for natural reasons: fire, water, soil composition. Elias's first instinct was geological. Then he saw what was in the center: stones, approximately 30 of them, ranging in size from a man's fist to a piece that would have required 2 men to lift comfortably. They were arranged with a deliberateness that nothing natural could account for. Elias wrote that he stood at the edge of that clearing and felt, for the first time on the expedition, something that his training had no category for. Not fear, exactly. Something more fundamental than fear. The recognition that what he was looking at had been placed by intention, and that the intention was not one he could read. The pattern was complex. He attempted to sketch it in the journal. The sketch, damaged by water, is only partially legible, but what survives suggests a form that several historians who have looked at it have described differently. A spiral, a sequence, a map. Nobody agrees. What they do agree on is that it wasn't random, and it wasn't simple. Dr. Voss knelt beside the nearest stone and examined it for several minutes. When he stood up, his expression was the one he wore when he was about to say something he wasn't going to enjoy saying. He told Elias that the stones had been shaped. The marks on them were not natural weathering. They had been worked with a tool, and the working had been done carefully by someone who knew what they were doing. He said he had encountered worked stone from several indigenous cultures in his years of practice in the region, and that these marks did not correspond to any of them. He said this in the same tone he would have used to describe a symptom that didn't fit any diagnosis he recognized. Tatum had not spoken. Elias asked him directly, had he seen anything like this before? Tatum looked at him for a long moment. Yes, once, he said, years ago, near the Arkansas border in similar country. He had been with a group of men who had decided to camp near a similar arrangement over his objections. By morning, 2 of them had walked away from camp in the night. Not run, walked, with purpose, as though they had somewhere specific to be. They were found 2 days later, alive. But, and here Tatum paused in the way that indicates the next word is going to be insufficient. Different. He said he couldn't describe the difference with any precision. They were recognizably the same men. They answered to their names. They knew where they were. But something in the way they occupied themselves had shifted. The way they looked at things, the pace of their responses, the sense, when you talked to them, that they were present, but also somewhere else at a slight remove from the conversation, as though part of their attention was permanently engaged with something that wasn't visible to anyone else. He said one of those men had told him later that he didn't remember walking away from camp. He said the last thing the man remembered was lying down to sleep. Elias wrote all of this. Then he wrote that they would camp at a respectful distance and move on in the morning. And he did something that I find, each time I read the journal, quietly remarkable. He drew a line under Tatum's account. And then he wrote, I record this not because I believe it. I record it because Tatum believes it. And Tatum is the most reliable man I have worked with in 16 years in the field. His belief warrants documentation. He was already somewhere beneath his professional instincts, building a record, just in case. Day 7. They left the clearing behind and made good time in the morning hours, and the quality of the air seemed to improve. Lighter, more ordinary, the forest sounds gradually returning to something closer to normal. Wesley had been quieter since the night of the creek, but his quietness was thoughtful rather than frightened, and by midday he was talking again, asking Tatum about the history of the Ozarks, about the people who had lived here before the current settlers, about the things that Tatum had seen in his years of moving through this country. Tatum answered carefully, not evasively, carefully. The way you answer questions when you want to be accurate, and accuracy requires time. He said the hills had been occupied for longer than most people considered, that the indigenous people who had lived here before European settlement had their own understanding of certain parts of the landscape, an understanding that expressed itself not in stories exactly, but in absences, places they did not name, routes they did not take, not because they feared those places in the ordinary sense of fear, but because they understood them as belonging to something that predated the human relationship with this landscape entirely, something that the hills contained the way a vessel contains water, not created by it, not defined by it, but shaped around it. Wesley asked what that something was. Tatum was quiet for a moment. Then he said he didn't think it had a shape that names fit around. They found the cabin in the early afternoon. It appeared at the base of a slope without warning, half consumed by the kind of overgrowth that takes 10 to 15 years to achieve that degree of thorough reclamation. The structure itself was intact. One room, from what the exterior suggested, built with competent if not skilled hands from timber that had been cut and notched with care. The door hung at an angle from a hinge that had corroded through on one side, leaving a gap that the vegetation had begun to fill with creeping runners of vine. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sound from inside, no sign on any surface visible from the outside of recent habitation. Elias sent 2 men in to assess the interior, while the rest of the party waited with the mules. They were inside for perhaps 4 minutes. When they came out, they stood for a moment before speaking. Their expressions were the expressions of men who have seen something that has not finished resolving into language. The cabin was empty of people. One room, a table, a cot frame with no mattress, a cold stone hearth. Whatever had been stored there or lived there, it was long gone. But the walls, every wall, floor to ceiling, the ceiling itself, in places, even sections of the floor near the hearth, writing, tight, even deliberate marks made in charcoal, covering every available surface with the systematic completeness of someone who had run out of everything else and used the only material and the only space remaining. The marks were not in English, not in French, not in any script that either of the 2 men could identify. They had the consistency of a true writing system, not a single repeated symbol, but a range of distinct marks that combined in patterns suggesting grammar, suggesting syntax, suggesting a language with internal rules that had simply been applied to an alphabet that no one in the party could read. Elias went in himself. He spent a long time in there. When he came out, he looked at the journal in his hand as though he was deciding something. Then he opened it and wrote for several minutes without speaking. He had attempted to copy sections of the writing. Several pages of his survey notebook, he noted, were now filled with reproductions of what he had seen on those walls. He could not read any of it. He did not know what it said, or who had written it, or over how long a period. But the consistency of the marks suggested one writer working over a significant span of time, not in a single session of frenzy, but methodically, deliberately, the way someone writes when they have a great deal to say and a great deal of time in which to say it. He noted one other thing, almost as an aside, tucked between observations about the timber construction and the hearth design. He wrote that the smell inside the cabin was wrong, not rot, not mildew, not the ordinary organic smell of a space long closed, something older, he wrote, like the air itself had been sealed in there since before the cabin was built, as though the cabin had simply been placed around air that was already there. He came outside. He looked at Tatum, who had not approached the cabin. Tatum was looking at the forest behind it. Elias asked what he was looking at. Tatum said, "Nothing yet." That night, nobody suggested going back to look at the writing again. Nobody suggested a lot of things. The fire was kept larger than usual. The watches were kept more alert than usual. The conversation around the fire, what there was of it, stayed close to practical things, the next day's route, the weather, the survey work. But underneath all of it, running like a current that everyone could feel but no one named, was the understanding that something about this part of the country was not the same as the rest of it. Elias wrote that night, before sleeping, "I have been in 23 states. I have surveyed mountains and swamps and desert. I have worked in places where the conditions were dangerous and places where the terrain was genuinely hostile and places where other men would not go. I have never, before tonight, felt that the land itself was paying attention to me. I record this observation not as a statement of belief, but as a statement of experience. Something in this hollow feels aware. I don't know what to do with that." He paused in his writing, then added, "I am going to keep doing my job." Now, right here, in the middle of this, I want to stop for a moment, because this episode is something special, and I want to make sure you know what you're listening to. This is a collaboration between Behind Dark Tales and The Fear Behind You, two channels that share a commitment to exactly this kind of story. Real accounts, suppressed histories, the things that official records decide to leave out. If you're subscribed to both, you already know what that means. If you're only subscribed to one, fix that right now. And if you're listening to this on any other channel, someone has taken this content without our permission. Please report it. Now, back to 1840. Day 8. The survey work was progressing. Elias was a professional, and professionals finish what they start, and so he took measurements and updated his maps and kept the party moving along the ridgeline. The sky was clear. The weather was holding. By any objective measure, it was a good day for field work. But the men were different, not visibly distressed, not showing the kind of overt fear that would have required Elias to address it directly, but quieter than they had been, less casual. The easy background conversation of men working together had been replaced by a kind of careful attentiveness, as though everyone had decided, independently and without discussion, to keep a closer watch on what was happening around them. Tatum walked ahead, as always, but he was stopping more often now, standing still in the way he stood still when he was thinking, with those pale eyes fixed and motionless, looking at the forest around him, reading it. Elias watched him do this several times throughout the day and noted that Tatum was consistently looking in the same direction when he stopped, southeast, toward the deeper part of the hollow, toward the country that the map showed as simply blank. Elias asked him around midday, what he was tracking. Tatum said he wasn't sure yet. He said it was more of a feeling that something was moving in the same general direction as the party, but at a distance, not following them exactly, moving parallel, keeping pace. Elias noted this without comment. That evening, the mules became unsettled. It happened just before midnight, by his watch. All four of them at the same time, not one triggering the others, but all four simultaneously pulling at their lines and making the low, continuous sound that indicates genuine distress rather than ordinary unease. Elias and two other men got up to settle them, and while they were standing at the picket line in the dark, they heard it. From the forest below the ridge, movement, footsteps, slow, deliberate, steady. Elias stood perfectly still and listened. He counted the interval between each footfall, because counting was what he did when he didn't know what else to do. The interval was consistent, and it was too long. The spacing between impacts on the ground was greater than any walking pace Elias had encountered in 16 years of field work, greater than a man's stride, greater than a horse's walk, greater than any animal he could picture that would produce a footfall sound of that weight. Whatever it was not confused. It was not rushing. It knew where it was going, and it was going there with absolute calm. The sound moved along the base of the ridge, maintaining a consistent distance from the camp, close enough to hear, far enough that the lantern light couldn't reach it. It continued for approximately 10 minutes. Then it stopped, not faded, stopped, one footfall, and then silence. The mules did not settle for a long time. No one in camp slept again that night. Elias wrote in the journal the following sentence: "I do not know what made those sounds. I know that I am not going to pretend I have an explanation. The ground here is soft enough that whatever walked on it should have left tracks. In the morning, we will look." In the morning, they looked. The slope below the ridge was soft, as Elias had noted, damp from recent rain, the kind of ground that records every step. They found nothing, no tracks, no disturbance, no indication that anything had walked through that forest in the night. Elias wrote one sentence about this. He wrote, "The ground here does not hold tracks the way it should." He had written it as though he had thought of it himself, but it was exactly what Tatum had said to him 2 weeks ago in Calder's Crossing. Day 9. 3 things happened. The first was Wesley. He was not at breakfast. His bedroll was in place. His pack was beside it. His boots, and this detail is in the journal, noted with the careful precision of a man who understands that details matter. His boots were placed neatly beside his pack, as though he had taken them off intentionally before leaving, not left behind in haste, set aside with care. He was found by 2 of the other men an hour later, sitting on a large flat rock approximately 200 yards from camp, facing east, watching the light come up through the trees. He was unhurt. He said he didn't remember leaving. He said the last thing he remembered was lying down to sleep. Dr. Voss examined him carefully and thoroughly. He questioned him about his memory of the previous day, the previous week, asked him to identify the men around him, asked him to describe where they were and why they were there. Wesley answered all of it correctly, without hesitation. But Voss noted, in the deposition he filed 2 years later, that something had shifted. He described it as a change in the quality of Wesley's presence, not his awareness. He was aware. alert, responsive. But there was a latency in his responses that hadn't been there before. A slight delay between the question and the answer, as though the answer were traveling a longer distance. And his eyes, Wesley's eyes, which had previously been one of the most immediately readable things about him, full of that easy, present attention, had acquired a quality that Voss struggled to describe clinically. He wrote, "He appeared to be looking at something other than what was directly before him, even when I was certain he was looking directly at me, as though his focal point were set slightly beyond the visible." The second thing was the return to the clearing. Tatum led the party that morning along a route he said he knew, a path he had walked years before that connected to a known trail several miles south, which would give them a reliable survey reference point. He had walked this route. He knew it. After 2 hours of walking on a bearing that Elias verified independently multiple times with his compass, they stepped out of the trees into the clearing with the stones. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment without moving or speaking. Then he checked his compass again. He looked at his notes from the earlier days. He checked the compass a third time. He had been walking south. His instruments confirmed it. He wrote, "I am a surveyor. I have never in 16 years been genuinely lost in the field. The compass is correct. We walked south. We are back where we began. I have no explanation for this, and I will not invent one." The third thing was the stones themselves. They had changed. The pattern, the spiral, or whatever it had been, was different. Not disturbed, not scattered, rearranged, with the same deliberateness, the same care, the same sense of intentional structure that had characterized the original arrangement. But it was unambiguously different. Something had moved those stones between their first visit and this one. And the new arrangement, this is in the journal noted by Elias, and confirmed in the deposition by 2 other men who were present, looked to every member of the party who looked at it less like a pattern and more like a message, less like something arranged for its own sake and more like something arranged for an audience, for someone who was expected to return. No one said this out loud at the clearing, but they were all thinking it. Elias noted in the journal that they would make camp here that night because moving through the forest had proven unreliable, and he preferred the known location. He also wrote something else, a single line, in smaller handwriting than the rest. He wrote, "I believe it already knows we're here." Day 10. By morning, there were 8. Fitch, a surveyor in his mid-30s, quiet and capable, the kind of man you trust precisely because he never draws attention to himself, was gone. No boots beside his pack, no signs of a calm, intentional departure like Wesley's. Simply absent. His bedroll was in place, his tools were there, everything he owned was there. He was not. Elias organized an immediate and thorough search. They called. They spread out in pairs across a wide radius from the camp, moving systematically, the way experienced field men search. They examined the ground for tracks. They checked every rocky overhang, every fallen tree, every hollow that a man might have stumbled into in the dark. They found nothing, not a boot print, not a thread of clothing on a branch, not a sound in response to their calls, nothing. Elias wrote that they would continue the search the following day, and that he would not leave the area until they found Fitch, or determined with certainty that finding him was not possible. That afternoon, On the second day of searching, Tatum said something. He said they were not going to find Fitch by searching. Elias asked what he meant. Tatum said, and Elias recorded this carefully, word for word, that if Fitch had gone the same way the two men had gone when Tatum was young, then he wasn't lost in any way that searching could address. He said there was a kind of going missing that looked like ordinary disappearance from the outside, but was something categorically different. He said that some of the oldest people in this part of the Ozarks, the ones whose families had been here long enough that the land had shaped them the way it shapes everything it holds long enough, they didn't have a name for what happened in places like this hollow. What they said instead was that certain places had worn thin, that the distance between what was here and what was not quite here had become less than it should be, like cloth washed too many times until you could almost see light through it. He said that when that distance got thin enough, things noticed, things on the other side, and sometimes they pressed against it, and sometimes when the cloth was thin enough in a particular spot, at a particular moment, under particular conditions that nobody had ever successfully defined or predicted, things came through. Not whole, not in the way that would be visible or comprehensible, but in a way that was enough. Elias sat with this for a long time. Then he wrote, in the journal, what I think is the most honest sentence in the whole document. He wrote, I don't have a category for what Tatum is describing. I have not had a category for several things that have happened in the last 5 days. I am beginning to think that the absence of a category is not the same as the absence of the thing. Day 11. They tried to leave. First light. Compass bearings checked and rechecked. Everyone in agreement about the direction. Tatum in the lead, Elias taking independent readings every 20 minutes to verify the course. They walked for 6 hours. At the end of 6 hours, Elias recognized the ridge below which they had heard the footsteps on the 8th night. He stood at the crest of that ridge and looked down at the tree line below and was quiet for a very long time. Then he turned to the party and said, with a steadiness that the journal records but cannot fully convey, that they would make camp here for the night and try again in the morning. He did not say anything else. That night, Aldous, a large, quiet man who had spoken perhaps 40 words in the entire expedition, who was known to the others only by that single name, who was somewhere in his early 50s and had the build and manner of a man who had spent his whole life doing heavy physical work without complaint, began to hum, a low, toneless sound, continuous, rhythmic, unvarying. Elias asked him to stop. Aldous did not respond, not in a way that suggested he hadn't heard. His eyes were open. He was clearly not asleep, but in the way of someone whose attention is entirely elsewhere. The hum continued at the same pitch, the same rhythm, as though it were not being produced consciously but was simply occurring, like breathing. Tatum moved away from the fire. Elias watched him go and did not call him back. He wrote, I don't know what Aldous hears, but the sound he's making is not a sound he was making yesterday, and it is not a sound that belongs to him. Whatever is in these hills, I believe it is very close now. I believe we are sitting on the place where the cloth is thin. I believe we have been sitting on it for days. Day 12. In the night, Aldous rose. He walked past Elias, who was on watch. Elias called to him. Aldous stopped. He turned. He looked at Elias with eyes that were completely awake, completely clear, without the glazed distance of sleepwalking. And underneath that clarity, something else, something that Elias described as contentment. Not the contentment of a man who is at ease, something deeper than that, more complete. The contentment of a man who has found the thing he has been looking for and is walking toward it and doesn't need anything else to be true. Elias stepped in front of him. Aldous stopped. They looked at each other for a moment that Elias could not time. And then Aldous smiled, turned around, and walked back to his bedroll. In the morning, he remembered nothing, but the hum was still there, very quiet, underneath his breathing all through breakfast. And when Elias looked at him across the fire, the contentment was still in his eyes, patient, waiting. Day 13 and day 14 and the morning of day 15. I'm going to tell you what happened during these days, and I want you to understand that I am giving you what the documents contain, not embellished, not dramatized, but also not softened. They could not leave. 3 more times they set out on bearings that every instrument confirmed were taking them north, toward Calder's Crossing, toward the edge of the hollow. 3 more times they returned to places they had already been. The cabin, the clearing, the ridge. The forest was not identical on every return. Details were different. The light sat differently. The creek ran on the left when it should have been on the right. Once they returned to the camp itself and found it as they had left it. Fire dead, bedrolls in place, Fitch's empty pack still sitting where it had been on the morning of his disappearance. 2 more men were gone by the morning of the 13th day. The journal does not describe their disappearances in detail. Elias wrote only, 2 more. I will not name them here. There is nothing to say about how it happened because I don't know how it happened. I know they were here and then they were not, and the ground held no record of them leaving. Wesley, by this point, was almost entirely silent. He walked when the party walked and stopped when they stopped and ate when food was given to him. He was cooperative, unhurt, physically present. But the remove that Voss had noted on the 9th day had deepened into something more complete. He was there in the way a photograph of a person is there, recognizably him, all the right features in all the right places, but something essential absent from the surface. When you spoke to him, he answered. When you didn't, he was looking at something you couldn't see. Tatum watched him with an expression that the journal describes simply as recognition, as though he had seen this before, and seeing it again confirmed something he had long since stopped hoping wouldn't be confirmed. On the 14th day, Elias made a decision. He stopped trying to navigate out. He stopped checking the compass. He sat down at the clearing. The stones again, in a new arrangement, again with that quality of having been left specifically for them. And he opened his journal and he wrote for a very long time. He wrote everything, from the first day, every detail he could remember that he hadn't already recorded. The quality of the light on the first morning, the way Tatum had looked at the map in Calder's Crossing, the exact sound of the footsteps beneath the ridge, the smell of the cabin, the arrangement of the stones in every configuration he had witnessed them in. Everything! And then he stopped writing, and he sat, and he waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but something in him understood. Below logic, below language, at the level of the body that knows things before the mind is ready to admit them, that the decision to stop trying to force an exit and simply be present was the right one, that whatever was in this hollow had been watching them struggle for days, and that the struggling had been, in some sense, irrelevant, that the question was not how to escape, but whether it would let them go. He sat, and eventually he wrote that it was the following morning before dawn. Something shifted. He could not describe what shifted, only that the forest felt different, not less strange, not less heavy, with whatever had been there all along, but permissive, as though a decision had been made. They broke camp at first light. They walked. They did not return to the clearing. They did not return to the cabin. They did not hear footsteps beneath the ridge. By late afternoon, they were standing at the edge of the deep hollow country, looking out at familiar ground. Ordinary Missouri forest, ordinary light, ordinary sound of birds and wind and the distant creek. 4 men came out: Elias Croft, Dr. Harlan Voss, Tatum, and Wesley, who walked on his own feet steadily, in silence, looking at something that existed in a range of perception that did not include anything the rest of them could see. 5 men did not come out. The businessmen in St. Louis denied the expedition had ever occurred. No records, no payment, no correspondence. They had never heard of Elias Croft. The deposition filed 2 years later by Wesley, under a name that was almost certainly not his own, contains this passage, which is the last thing I'll read to you from the primary sources. He wrote, "Whatever it was that I encountered in that clearing, I cannot describe it in terms that would be believed. I will say only this: it was not new. It was not surprised by us. It had been in those hills far longer than the hills had been called the Ozarks, far longer than any name given to them by any people. It does not need to rush. It does not need to pursue. It waits, and the waiting is enough, because time works differently for it than it does for us. And when the distance gets thin enough, in the right place, at the right moment, it reaches through. Not to harm, not from malice, from something that has no name in any language I know, something that might be curiosity, something that might be hunger, something that might be loneliness, in a scale and duration so far beyond human loneliness that the word barely fits. It reached through, and it took what it took. And then it let the rest of us go. And I have not spent a single day since without knowing that it is still there, that it is still waiting, that the cloth is still thin in that hollow, that it will still be thin long after everyone who was there that April is gone from this world entirely. Tatum lived until 1863. He never went back into the deep hollow country. In the years after the expedition, neighbors noted that he had developed a habit of sitting on his porch at night, facing south, watching the dark line of the hills against the sky. Not with fear, with the careful, steady attention of someone watching something they know is still there. Elias Croft disappears from all records after 1848. No death certificate, no property transaction, no legal record of any kind in any county where he had previously been documented. The tin box found in 1896 was buried under the floor of a farmhouse in a town that no longer exists under that name. The farmhouse had not been occupied for at least 20 years before the box was found. No one knows how long the journal had been there. No one knows why the farmhouse was where it was. No one knows who buried it, or when, or whether they were the person who wrote it. the deep, hollow country is still there. It doesn't appear on modern maps under any name that matches the descriptions in the journal. It has no protected status, no monument, no marker of any kind. But there are people who live on the edges of certain parts of the Ozarks who know that some ground is not the same as other ground, who have known it all their lives without being able to say why, who avoid certain hollows not out of superstition, but out of something older than superstition, an understanding in the body, passed down through families the way all deep knowledge gets passed down, that some places belong to something that was here before us and will be here after us, and that the appropriate response to that is not curiosity, but respect and distance. The cloth is still thin in certain places, and whatever is on the other side of it is still there, still patient, still waiting for the distance to wear thin enough. And right now, wherever you are, whatever light you have around you, whatever sounds are outside your window, some part of you, that part that lives below the rational, below the explainable, recognizes that this story is not only about 1840. It is about now. It is about every place you've walked past and felt wrong, every moment in the night when the silence changed, every shadow at the edge of your vision that was gone when you turned to look. It's been here the whole time. It just doesn't always let you notice. So, do you believe that there are places where the distance between what we understand and what we can't gets thin? Tell me in the comments. Tell me about a place you've been. A road, a stretch of forest, a room, a hollow in the landscape that didn't feel right, where something registered in your body before your mind had any explanation for it. I read every single one. And if you have a story or something from your family, something that was passed down, something that's never been properly told, share it with us. It might be next. This has been a collaboration between Behind Dark Tales and The Fear Behind You. 2 channels, 1 darkness. Stay with us. And until next time, keep the light close. And if the silence changes tonight, pay attention to it.